Ambassador Elena Vasquez sat in the massive council chamber and watched the alien delegates argue about humanity's latest proposal with barely concealed contempt on their faces. 3 years had passed since Earth made first contact with the Galactic Council, and 3 years since humanity began what they thought would be diplomatic negotiations with the established powers of the galaxy. The chamber itself was designed to intimidate with its towering crystal pillars and holographic displays that showed the vast territories controlled by the 7 major species who made up the Council's leadership. Elena had memorized every detail of this room during countless sessions, where human proposals were dismissed, delayed, or denied outright trade. Prince Zolvan of the Zephyrini dominated the center platform with his forearms spread wide in a gesture that his species used to show dominance and dismissal. At the same time, his scales shimmered with colors that human xenobiologists had identified as displays of superiority and mild amusement. Beside him floated the Krell Overseer, whose name humans translated as he who manages lesser concerns, which told you everything you needed to know about Krell attitudes. Toward newer species, the Overseer's gelatinous body pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that Elena's translator chip rendered as bureaucratic. Condescension, the human proposal is again rejected, Zolvan announced, with what passed for a smile among his people, showing rows of crystalline teeth. Your species lacks the necessary development stage to participate in unrestricted trade throughout council space. Elena remained perfectly still in her seat while her aide Marcus Chen shifted uncomfortably beside her. They had heard variations of this rejection dozens of times before, always with the same underlying message that humans were too primitive, too aggressive, too unpredictable to be trusted with the same rights as established species. The Overseer's translator produced its wet, bubbling voice that somehow managed to sound patronizing in any language, to propose instead a revised probationary status for humanity. It said while holographic text appeared in the air showing the terms of what the council called a generous offer. Elena read through the terms quickly. Though she had seen similar proposals before and knew what was coming, humanity would be restricted to its current 12 colony worlds with no new settlements allowed for 50 standard years. Human trade would go through council-approved intermediaries, who would naturally take substantial cuts of every transaction. Human vessels would be limited in both size and number to prevent what the council termed destabilizing military buildups. Most insulting was the tribute requirement, where Earth would provide resources, technology samples, and even human advisors to council species as a show of good faith and proper deference to established powers. Marcus leaned close and whispered urgently, "Ambassador, this is worse than the last offer, and they know we can't accept these terms." Elena nodded slightly, but kept her eyes on Zolvan, who was clearly enjoying what he thought was humanity's powerless position. The trade prince continued speaking while gesturing to displays that showed human colonies as tiny dots surrounded by vast council territories. "You may of course refuse this generous offer," Zolvan said with false magnanimity, "though we would hate to see humanity choose isolation over cooperation with the galactic community." The threat was clear, and not even particularly subtle. Refuse and face economic sanctions, blocked trade routes, and diplomatic isolation that would strangle human expansion before it truly began was the same threat that Council had used to bring dozens of other species into line over the centuries, accept and become a permanent underclass in galactic civilization, always dependent on Council mercy and never permitted to rise to genuine quality. Elena had spent 3 years listening to threats dressed up as diplomacy and watching human negotiators treated like children begging for scraps at the adults' table. She thought about the reports waiting in her secure files back on the human diplomatic ship, reports about council trade practices that amounted to sanctioned exploitation and how smaller species were kept deliberately dependent through a combination of economic manipulation and military intimidation. She thought about the Ralathi, whose homeworld resources had been extracted by Zephyrini corporations for 200 years in exchange for technology that the Council could have provided freely, but chose to parcel out as rewards for good behavior. She thought about the Venn Collective, who had tried to establish independent trade routes only to face Council warships blockading their space until they submitted to approved channels. Most of all she thought about Earth's response teams, who had been working around the clock for months, preparing for what now seemed inevitable. Economists who had modeled every scenario, and the military planners who had calculated response times, and the diplomatic corps who had quietly reached out to dozens of independent worlds and minor species. Tired of Council control, Alina stood up smoothly and gathered her data tablets while every eye in the chamber turned toward her with confusion. Normally, human ambassadors would ask for time to consider, would propose counteroffers, would negotiate desperately to find some compromise that the Council would eventually reject anyway. Instead, Alina smiled, and the expression seemed to puzzle the assembled aliens who had never seen a human negotiator smile during these sessions. "We're done here," she said clearly, and her translator broadcast the words in every major galactic language. Selvon S. Scales flickered through several colors that indicated surprise and uncertainty. "You wish to request a recess to consult with your government?" he asked, though he sounded less confident than before. "No," Alina replied. "Well." Marcus scrambled to gather his materials and follow her. Toward the exit, humanity withdraws from all negotiations with the Galactic Council, effective immediately. The chamber erupted in noise as delegates from dozens of species began speaking at once in confusion and alarm. The overseer's body flashed bright red, which human xenologists had identified as Krell anger. "Cannot simply leave," it protested, while its voice took on a sharp edge. "There are protocols and procedures that must be followed." Alina stopped at the chamber entrance and turned back to face the assembled Council one final time. "You've spent 3 years telling us what we cannot do and what we are not permitted to have," she said calmly. "You've made it clear that you see humanity as inferiors who should be grateful for whatever scraps you choose to throw our way. Well, we're no longer interested in begging for basic dignity." She let that statement hang in the air for a moment. While delegates processed what they were hearing, as of now, Earth recalls all diplomatic staff from Council space, and we will not be sending replacements. Human trade negotiators are withdrawing from all Council markets, and human vessels will avoid Council-controlled space whenever possible. We will send one final official statement to the Council, and after that humanity has nothing more to say to you." Marcus was pale but managed to keep his expression neutral as he stood beside his ambassador around the chamber. Various species reacted with everything from shock to amusement to what looked like concern on the faces of the smaller delegations, who perhaps understood something that the major powers did not. Solvin covered his composure and laughed, which sounded like crystals chiming together. "You think you can survive without Council markets?" asked mockingly. "Your colonies need resources that only flow through our trade networks, and your expansion depends on navigation data that we control. Return in a few months when reality has taught you proper humility." Alina's smile never wavered, and that seemed to disturb the trade prince more than any argument would have. "We'll see," was all she said before turning and walking out of the Council chamber, with Marcus following quickly behind. The massive doors sealed behind them with a sound like thunder, and Alina allowed herself one long breath before straightening her shoulders. "Contact the ship," she told Marcus quietly. "Signal code Prometheus." Marcus's eyes widened because he knew what that code meant, even if he hadn't been cleared for all the details. Prometheus was the contingency plan that Earth had been developing since the first year of negotiations. When it became clear that the Council would never accept humanity as equals, it was named for the Titan who gave fire to humanity in ancient myth, and the name was chosen very deliberately. "All of it?" Marcus asked to confirm he understood the order. "Everything." Alina confirmed as they walked toward the docking bay where their ship waited. "It's time the galaxy learned that humanity doesn't need permission to be free." Trade Prince Zolvan reviewed the human withdrawal statement for the 5th time and still could not quite believe what he was reading. The message was brief, formal, and completely inflexible in a way that no species had ever addressed the Council before. "The United Government of Earth hereby withdraws from all diplomatic and economic negotiations with the Galactic Council." It read in plain standard language. "We thank the Council for their time, but have determined that our interests are not aligned, and further discussion would be unproductive. Humanity will pursue its own path forward and wishes the Council well in their future endeavors." That was it, and no amount of analysis could extract any hidden meaning or room for negotiation. From those simple sentences, the human diplomatic compound on Nexus Station has been emptied within 48 hours, and every human trade representative throughout Council space had departed on scheduled transports back to Earth territory. Calvin had expected anger or at least some attempt at leverage, but instead humanity had simply packed up and left like guests departing a party. They no longer found entertaining in the council chambers. A week after the human withdrawal, the mood was celebratory. Among the major species, they will return within 3 months, predicted Overseer Calvish, who had replaced the previous Krell representative in one of their periodic bureaucratic reshufflings. No developing species can sustain expansion without access to council markets, the representatives from the Hask Dominion, and the Vrin Supremacy murmured agreement, while smaller delegations remained noticeably quiet. Sylvan noticed their silence but dismissed it as irrelevant because minor species always worried too much about change. What mattered was that the major powers understood reality, and the reality was that the council controlled the established trade routes, the resource-rich systems, and most importantly, the technology that made rapid expansion possible. Humanity had a handful of colonies and a modest fleet of ships that were impressive for a young species, but laughably small compared to council resources. Them try to go it alone for a while, and they would learn the same lesson every other species had learned about the price of pride too. Months passed, and the expected human delegation begging to resume talks never arrived. Instead, something strange began happening in the independent territories and border regions that the council considered too poor or troublesome to bother controlling. Directly, human merchant ships appeared in those systems, offering trade deals that made Zephyrny commercial. Agents filed urgent reports back to their corporate houses. The humans were selling manufactured goods, medical supplies, and agricultural products at prices that seemed impossibly low, while buying local resources at rates that independent worlds had never seen before. It's a temporary measure, Zovan assured the worried trade representatives from various Zephyrny houses. They're bleeding money to make a point, but they cannot sustain such practices, and when their reserves run out, they will have no choice but to return to proper channels. But the human trade offensive didn't slow down, and in fact, seemed to be expanding. Reports came in of human colony ships launching at a rate that violated the population distribution guidelines the council had suggested during negotiations. Apparently had no intention of honoring those guidelines. Now that they were no longer seeking council approval, intelligence analysts brought Zolvan projections showing that humanity would have 30 new colonies within 2 years if they maintained their current rate of expansion. This is unacceptable, he declared while his scales flushed colors indicating serious concern. Contact the human government through back channels and inform them that such aggressive expansion will be viewed as hostile action. The response from Earth's foreign ministry was brief and pointed. Humanity is expanding within unclaimed space and poses no threat to council territories, it stated. We are unaware of any galactic law that restricts peaceful colonization and would be interested to learn what authority the council believes it has over sovereign human decisions. The message was polite, but the underlying challenge was clear, and Zolvan found himself in the unfamiliar position of having no good answer. The council's control had always relied on a combination of economic dependence and the implicit threat of military force, but humanity was deliberately avoiding both levers. They weren't trading through council channels, so they couldn't be economically pressured, and they weren't violating any actual laws, so military action would look like naked aggression against a peaceful species. For months after the withdrawal, the economic reports started showing impacts that went beyond human trading. In marginal markets, the Raylethi, who had been extracting resources for Zephyrny corporations for 2 centuries, suddenly requested renegotiation of their contracts. When the corporations refused, the Raylethi announced they had found alternative buyers who offered better terms, and those buyers turned out to be human trading companies. Similar patterns emerged across a dozen systems as species who had been locked into unfavorable council arrangements discovered they now had options. The humans didn't demand exclusive contracts or long-term commitments, and instead offered simple deals with transparent pricing and none of the fees and restrictions that council intermediaries imposed. Overseer Calvish called an emergency session to discuss what it termed human economic interference in stable markets. The assembled delegates reviewed reports showing trade volume flowing away from council channels at an alarming rate. They are operating at a loss, insisted of Rin, commercial analyst. While displaying financial projections, no species can offer such favorable terms and remain profitable. But a Krell economist raised a tentacle in disagreement. Our models assumed humans would need to purchase navigation data, mining rights, and technology licenses from council sources, it explained. However, it appears they have been developing their own alternatives, and their cost structure is completely different from what we projected. The room fell silent as the implications of that assessment settled over the assembly. If humans weren't dependent on council resources for their expansion, then all the carefully calculated economic controls that kept other species in line simply didn't apply. Solvin demanded a full intelligence briefing on human activities, and what he learned over the following week made his scales turn colors. Associated with deep and ease, human shipyards were constructing vessels at a pace that suggested Earth had far more industrial capacity than anyone had estimated. The designs were human-developed rather than purchased. Council technology, which meant no licensing fees and no built-in dependencies. More concerning were reports of human naval vessels that significantly exceeded the size and capability ranges the Council had designated as appropriate for developing species. When Zolvin sent a formal protest about these ships, the human response noted politely that those had been suggestions during negotiations that were no longer ongoing. 6 months after the withdrawal, the Council faced its first real crisis when the Venn Collective formally requested that human merchant fleets be granted passage through Venn space. The Venn had been under informal Council sanctions for a decade after attempting to establish independent trade routes, and were supposed to be an example of what happened to species who defied Council authority. Now, they were openly partnering with humanity, and there was nothing the Council could legally do about it because the Venn were technically sovereign, even if they had been economically isolated. We must show strength, argued the Hask Dominion representative while displaying battle plans for a blockade of Venn space. If we allow this defiance to stand, then every minor species will believe they can ignore Council guidance. But the Krell overseer raised an objection that revealed how much the situation had changed. The humans have issued a statement declaring that any military action against their trading partners will be considered an act of war against humanity itself. It reported they have positioned naval vessels along the Venn border in what they term a peacekeeping presence. The chamber erupted in angry debate, because this was exactly the kind of aggressive posturing that the Council had spent 3 years telling humans was unacceptable. Except now humanity wasn't asking for permission and wasn't particularly concerned about Council opinions on acceptable behavior. Arkshelvin reviewed the tactical assessments of human and naval capabilities and felt something he had not experienced in his long career as trade prince. The humans had more ships than intelligence had estimated, and those ships incorporated technology that suggested Earth's research programs were more advanced than anyone had realized. They weren't the primitive newcomers that Council experts had dismissed during those early negotiations. Full military confrontation would be costly, and the outcome was no longer certain. More species were requesting human trade relationships, and to minor Council members had quietly suggested that perhaps the rules about approved intermediaries were too restrictive. The celebration that had filled the Council chambers 6 months ago had been replaced by worried discussions and urgent strategy sessions. Humanity had called the Council's bluff, and everyone was starting to realize that the leverage they thought they had over Earth had been largely imagined. Stared at population projections showing human colonies spreading across previously unclaimed space like a growing web. The Krell industrial world of Ventok had operated the same way for 300 years, with workers extracting rare minerals under contracts that guaranteed the Council received resources at fixed prices far below market value. Plant manager Scholrek reviewed the production reports with satisfaction because quotas were being met and profits were being properly distributed to the appropriate Krell corporate entities. Then the human ship arrived, and everything Scholrek thought he understood about labor relations began to unravel. The vessel called itself a merchant trader, but intelligence reports suggested it was also carrying diplomatic staff and possibly human labor organizers. though such categories seemed to blur together in human operations. They requested permission to orbit and were denied, but the humans simply moved to the edge of the system and began broadcasting on open channels any Krell workers interested in alternative employment opportunities are invited to review human labor contracts and compensation packages. The message stated in clear standard language. All consultations are private and voluntary, with no obligation to accept any offers. Scholrek immediately filed protests with system authorities and sent urgent messages to the council about this blatant attempt to interfere with proper business operations, but the council's response was frustratingly vague about what actions could be taken against humans, who were technically not violating any laws by offering employment. Meanwhile, workers were accessing the human broadcasts, and what they saw there was causing dangerous unrest. Human corporations were offering contracts that paid 3 times standard rates, limited work periods to what they called humane hours, and included medical coverage that extended to workers' families. It was absurd and clearly unsustainable propaganda. But the workers didn't understand economics the way management did within. A weak Scholrek faced his first labor strike in a career spanning 4 decades. Workers demanded contract renegotiations and cited human employment standards as proof that better conditions were possible. Those are lies designed to destabilize our operations, Scholrek explained to the strike leaders with as much patience as he could muster. Humans cannot actually afford to pay such wages and provide such benefits across their workforce. The strike leader, whose name translated as "he who carries heavy burdens," gestured with 2 of his lesser tentacles in a sign of polite disagreement. The humans provided financial documentation showing their costs and profit margins. He said while displaying data tablets, their corporations operate with smaller profit percentages, but higher total revenues, because their workers are more productive and loyal. Scholrek reviewed the documents with growing alarm because they appeared legitimate, and suggested that human economic models were completely different from council standards where Krell corporations maximized profits by minimizing labor costs. The humans seemed to be building their economy around high wages and worker satisfaction. It made no sense according to traditional business theory, but the numbers were difficult to argue with. The strike spread to other Krell worlds, and similar labor actions began appearing on Zephrony industrial planets and Vryn mining operations everywhere. The pattern was the same, with workers demanding human-style contracts and threatening to seek employment with human corporations if their demands weren't betrayed. Prince Zolvan watched his commercial empire begin to crack as corporate houses reported labor costs rising across the board. Houses could either match human offers and accept reduced profits, or maintain their traditional pay scales and watch skilled workers depart for human operations. Some houses chose to dig in and refused any concessions to worker demands. Those corporations discovered that humans were happy to hire experienced alien workers and transport them to human colonies where they were integrated into mixed species work environments. Forts from those workers spread through communication networks and painted pictures of human facilities that seemed almost too good to be true. Fair wages and reasonable hours and medical care and educational opportunities for workers. Children Caishlin wanted to dismiss it all as propaganda, but independent journalists from minor species were visiting human worlds and confirming the accounts. Worse was happening in the commercial sectors where human trading companies were destroying carefully maintained monopolists. The Zephrony had controlled the market for advanced medical supplies for 2 centuries by carefully managing prices and supply to maximize profit. Human pharmaceutical companies entered the market and began selling similar medicines at 1/3 the price while still somehow making enough profit to sustain operations. The Zephrony tried price competition, but discovered that humans could go lower, as they weren't supporting the layers of intermediaries and licensing fees that the council business models required. Medical facilities across the galaxy began switching to human suppliers, and patients who had suffered under expensive Zephrony treatments suddenly had access to affordable care. Similar collapses happened in technology markets and manufactured goods and agricultural products, as human companies offered quality items at prices that council corporations couldn't match without losing money. Emergency sessions of the council's economic committee produced report after report trying to understand how humans were achieving Such competitive advantages, the answer that kept emerging was uncomfortable and challenged. Fundamental assumptions about how galactic commerce was supposed to work. Humans had developed their industries without council oversight, and therefore without the built-in inefficiencies that came from licensing requirements, regulatory capture, and the expectation that businesses existed primarily to enrich political elites. Human companies competed with each other on Earth, which drove innovation and efficiency in ways that council markets had not experienced in centuries. They moved into galactic markets, they brought that competitive culture with them, and council corporations built on monopolistic practices couldn't keep up the VRIN. Supremacy tried to ban human goods from their territory, but discovered that smuggling was impossible to prevent, and the black market for human products simply drove up prices while making criminals wealthy. Hask Dominion attempted to impose tariffs that would neutralize human price advantages, but their own merchants protested, because those tariffs would hurt Hask consumers and traders who benefited from cheap human goods. Everywhere the council turned, they found that traditional methods of control were ineffective against an economic system they didn't fully understand, and couldn't easily counter small species that had been economically dependent on council markets for generations. Suddenly had alternatives. The Talvik Union, which had been paying tribute to the Zephyrini for mining rights in their own system, negotiated a direct deal with human resource companies. The humans paid fair market rates and didn't require tribute or political concessions. When the Zephyrini protested, the Talvik pointed out that their agreement with the trade princes had expired 2 years ago, and they were under no obligation to renew it on unfavorable terms. 3 minor council members announced they were exploring trade agreements with human companies. Major powers demanded they reconsider, but the minor members pointed out that council rules actually allowed free trade, and they were simply exercising their legal rights. Eitzelven realized with growing dread that the entire structure of council economic control had been built on assumptions that no one had seriously questioned. In century, species accepted unfavorable terms because they had no alternatives. They paid tribute and accepted subordinate positions because challenging the council meant isolation and economic destruction. But humans had proven that alternatives existed, and that isolation from council markets was not only survivable, but potentially profitable. The galaxy was learning that the council's authority had always been more performance than substance, now that one species had called that performance what it was. Other species were increasingly willing to do the same. 10 months after humanity's withdrawal from negotiations, the Council's economic reports showed declining trade volumes and reduced revenues across all major markets. Corporate entities were reporting lower profits, and some were facing actual losses for the first time in living memory. Labor costs were rising everywhere as workers demanded improvements. Technology monopolies were breaking down as human innovations entered the market. Resource extraction was becoming more expensive as worlds insisted on fair compensation. The minor species who made up the bulk of the Council's membership were openly questioning whether the current system served their interests, and through it all, humanity continued expanding and building and trading with anyone who approached them in good faith. They made no demands for Council recognition or approval. They simply operated as though the Council's opinions were irrelevant for species who had built their entire political identity around being the galaxy's dominant powers. That indifference was more threatening than any military challenge could have been. Aversier Calvish reviewed population projections showing human colonies spreading across the independent territories. Within 5 years, humanity would have more settled worlds than the Krell. Within 10, they might rival the Zephyrini in total population, and every one of those colonies was becoming a hub for independent trade and economic activity that bypassed council control entirely. Intelligence analyst Vekmer of the Krell Special Operations Division had spent 6 months embedded on the human colony world of New Vancouver, and what he had witnessed there terrified him in ways that no military threat ever could. His mission had been straightforward enough, which was to assess human military capabilities and identify weaknesses that council forces could exploit if conflict became inevitable. But Vekmar had discovered something far more dangerous than weapons or warships. He had discovered that humans were building a completely different kind of civilization, New Vancouver. It's humanity's 17th colony and had been settled only 4 years before. Vecmar's arrival, according to standard council models, such a young colony should still be struggling with basic infrastructure and entirely dependent on the homeworld for advanced goods. Instead, Vecmar found a thriving community of 60,000 humans and almost 20,000 aliens from a dozen different species. The colony had working fusion power plants and advanced manufacturing facilities and agricultural systems that were already producing surplus food. What struck him most was how the different species interacted with complete casualness. Humans worked alongside Relathi engineers and Talvek farmers, and even a few Krell who had left council space seeking better opportunities. There were no segregated districts or species hierarchies. Human supervisor might report to a Ralathi manager who reported to a human director, and nobody seemed to find this arrangement unusual or problematic. Vicar attended a town council meeting as part of his cover identity and watched as citizens of 6 different species debated local infrastructure projects. They voted on proposals, with each individual getting 1 vote regardless of their species or how long they had lived on the colony. Young Ralathi woman, whose family had arrived only 6 months ago, had exactly the same political voice. As humans who had been there since the founding, the concept was so alien to council, thinking that Vecmar had to review his translator several times to confirm he was understanding correctly. Council space political power correlated directly with species status and economic contribution. It's the idea that newcomers and established residents would have equal say in governance struck him as a recipe for chaos, yet somehow it seemed to work, and the colony functioned with an efficiency that matched or exceeded council worlds with centuries of development. Interviewed a Krell named Sholmak, who had emigrated from Ventok after the labor strikes. "Why did you leave?" Vecmar asked, while trying to sound casually curious rather than professionally interested. Sholok gestured with his tentacles in a way that indicated contentment on Ventok. "I was a worker," he explained simply. "Here I am, a person, and my children attend schools with human children, and they will have opportunities I never dreamed possible. Do the humans treat you as equals?" Vecmar pressed because he needed to understand if this was genuine or merely sophisticated propaganda. "They treat me as family," Sholmak replied, and the emotion in his voice seemed completely authentic. "When my spouse became ill, the community organized meals for my family and human. Neighbors volunteered to care for my children, and nobody asked for payment or favors in return. That is how humans live," Vecmar filed reports back to council intelligence, but found himself struggling to convey what he was observing in ways that his superiors would understand. How could he explain that humans shared advanced technology freely with alien partners because they believed that raising everyone's capabilities benefited the whole community? How could he describe seeing human military officers training Talvek security forces in modern combat techniques with no apparent concern that those same Talvek might someday oppose human interests? Council's entire approach to security was built on maintaining technological advantages and ensuring potential rivals remained weak. Humans seemed to operate on completely opposite principles. He visited human shipyards and watched mixed species crews constructing vessels that incorporated design elements from a half-dozen different traditions. Our Ralathi engineer explained that humans actively sought out alien perspectives on ship design because they believed diversity made their vessels more versatile. "We don't assume we have all the answers," the engineer told Vecmar cheerfully. "Why would we, when the galaxy is full of species who have been building ships longer than humans have had spaceflight?" The naval base orbiting New Vancouver was equally revelatory. Human warships were indeed larger and more heavily armed than Council intelligence had estimated, but that wasn't what disturbed Vecmar. What disturbed him was watching human crews drilling alongside alien auxiliaries in coordinated maneuvers. The humans were building an integrated military force that included volunteers from dozens of species, trained together and lived together, and according to the officers Vecmar interviewed, they would fight together if necessary. "We call it the Coalition Defense Force," explained Commander Sarah Okonkwo during a tour of her destroyer. "Humans provide the ships and the organizational structure, but we're building something bigger than just a human navy. Every species has something to contribute, and we're learning from each other. Vecmar asked the obvious question that any council observer would ask. What happens when human interests conflict with the interests of your alien crew members? Okonkwo had smiled at that, as though the question revealed something about Vecmar's assumptions. Our interests don't conflict because we're working toward the same goals, she said patiently. Freedom and security and prosperity for all our people, regardless of which world they were born on. That's what the coalition is about. He filed that away as idealistic propaganda, but then spent the next month watching how it actually worked in practice when a dispute arose between human colonists and Relothian emigrants over water usage rights. The colony government convened a mediation panel with equal representation from both groups. Negotiated a solution that involved new infrastructure to expand water access rather than rationing what existed. Nobody won completely, but everyone got something, and both sides seemed satisfied with the outcome. When pirates raided a Talvek mining outposts in a neighboring system, human naval vessels responded within hours, despite the outpost having no formal defense treaty with Earth Commander. Okonkwo's destroyer was first on scene and recovered the survivors and hunted down the pirates with ruthless efficiency. The Telvek government offered payment for the rescue, but the humans refused. You're part of the coalition, Okonkwo told the Talvek representative. We protect each other, and that's not something you pay for. Vecmar watched this incident with growing unease because he recognized what he was seeing the humans were building something that looked like what council propaganda claimed the council itself was supposed to be. Genuine alliance of equals working together for mutual benefit, except this version was actually real. He began compiling his final report and struggled with how to frame his conclusions. The truth was that humanity didn't need to conquer the council through military force. They were simply building an alternative that was so obviously superior that species were choosing it voluntarily. World that joined the coalition was one less world under council influence. Every worker who emigrated to human space was one less worker supporting council industries. Every ship that joined the coalition defense force was one more challenge too. Council military supremacy. The mathematics were brutally simple. Humanity had 40 colony worlds. Now, it was adding approximately 10 more each year. Colony became a center for trade and immigration and cultural exchange. The network effect was exponential, with each new world making the coalition more attractive to potential members. Within a decade, the coalition would have more worlds than the council. Within 2 decades, it would have more resources and more people and more industrial capacity. And all of this was happening not through conquest or coercion, but through the simple fact that humans offered something better. They offered equality and opportunity and a voice in governance. They offered economic systems that didn't require tribute or subordination. They offered military protection without demanding political control in return. Weimar completed his report with a recommendation that would likely end his career. Council victory through military action is possible. Wrote, but such victory would be temporary because it does not address the fundamental reason species are choosing humans over the council. Military force can destroy human colonies, but it cannot destroy the idea of what humans have built. That idea will survive and spread and eventually replace council authority regardless of what military actions are taken. The only sustainable path forward is to accept that the old system is ending and negotiate a place for council species in the new order that humans are creating. He transmitted the report through encrypted channels and waited for the response he knew would come. 3 days later, he received orders to return to council space immediately for debriefing. Vakar looked around his small apartment in New Vancouver, where he had lived among humans and aliens who treated each other as equals. He thought about Sholmak's children playing with human kids in the park. He thought about Commander Okonkwo's crew working together, as though species differences were just interesting details rather than barriers. He thought about town council meetings, where everyone had a voice. Ambassador Alina Vasquez returned to Nexus Station, exactly 2 years after she had walked out of the council chambers, and the changes that had occurred in that time were visible everywhere she looked. The station itself seemed shabbier somehow. With maintenance clearly being deferred and fewer commercial vessels docked at the trading ports, the Grand Council Plaza that had once bustled with traders and diplomats from hundreds of worlds was noticeably quieter. Lena recognized the signs of an empire in decline. Her ship docked without incident, though she noted the security forces seemed less numerous than during her previous visits. Coalition now had its own diplomatic stations that were handling most of the galaxy's real business. While Nexus Station had become increasingly irrelevant, Marcus Chen walked beside her as they made their way through corridors that felt almost empty compared to the crowds she remembered. "It's sad in a way," Marcus observed quietly while looking at shuttered shops and vacant office spaces. "They built something impressive here once, even if it was fundamentally unjust." Alina nodded because she understood the sentiment even if she didn't share it. "They built an impressive system for controlling others," she replied. "That's not the same thing as building something worth preserving." The council had requested this meeting through carefully worded diplomatic notes that avoided any suggestion of desperation. They wanted to discuss normalizing relations and establishing frameworks for cooperation between the council and what they carefully termed human-affiliated worlds. Everyone knew what the meeting was really about. Council was losing, and they wanted to negotiate surrender terms before they lost everything. The chamber where Alina had spent 3 frustrating years was half empty now. Only 4 of the 7 major species had sent representatives, and several of the minor species seats were vacant. Trade Prince Zolvan was gone and had been replaced by a younger Zephyrini named Kelser, who wore the colors of someone trying very hard to project confidence he didn't feel. The Krell overseer was actually the same individual she remembered, but he seemed diminished somehow, with his bioluminescent displays flickering uncertainly. The Hask and Vryn representatives looked uncomfortable. 3 minor species who had formerly joined the coalition sat in what used to be visitor seats and were apparently here as observers. To ensure the council didn't try to manipulate humanity again, Ambassador Vasquez Kelser began with elaborate courtesy. "We appreciate your willingness to meet with us after our previous difficulties." Lena took her seat and maintained a polite, neutral expression. "The coalition believes in dialogue," she replied, "though I should clarify that I'm here representing the coalition as a whole and not just humanity." She let that correction hang in the air because it was important that the council understood the reality. This wasn't about humans negotiating special treatment for themselves. It was about a new power structure that had already replaced the council in everything but formal recognition. Klez's scales flickered through several colors before settling on something that human xenologists translated as reluctant acceptance. "Of course," he said carefully, "we understand that circumstances have changed since our last discussions. The council hopes to establish productive relationships with all peaceful species, including those who have chosen to affiliate with human initiatives." The overseer projected a holographic display showing proposed trade agreements and technology exchange programs. Lena reviewed them quickly and recognized immediately what they represented. The council was offering everything they had refused to years ago: full technology sharing and equal trade status and recognition of coalition territorial claims. They were even offering to restructure council governance to give member species more voice in decision-making. It was a complete capitulation, dressed up in diplomatic language. "These proposals are interesting," Alina said neutrally, "but they don't address the fundamental issues that led to the coalition's formation." Kelser leaned forward and his scales showed confusion. "We are offering equal status and full participation in council structures," he protested. "What more could the coalition want?" Lena pulled up her own presentation, and the holographic displays showed the galaxy as it currently existed. Coalition worlds were marked in blue and council territories in red 2 years ago. The map had been almost entirely red with tiny blue dots representing human colonies. Now blue covered nearly a quarter of the mapped galaxy and was growing steadily. "The coalition doesn't want to join the council," she explained patiently. "We want to replace it with something better." The room erupted in agitated sounds from various species. The Vryn representative gestured sharply in what his species used to indicate offense. "The council has maintained galactic peace for over 1,000 years," he said angrily. You cannot simply dismiss that achievement. Alina waited for the noise to settle before responding. The council maintained stability, she corrected. That's not the same thing as peace or justice. You kept species weak and dependent while claiming to protect them. You extracted resources from worlds that had no choice but to accept your terms. You built monopolies that enriched the powerful while keeping billions in poverty. She gestured to the coalition observers. These species are here because they remember what council membership actually meant. They remember the tribute payments and the restricted development and the constant message that they were inferior and should be grateful for whatever scraps they received. One of the observers was Aralathi, who had served as her government's representative during the old negotiation sheet, stood and addressed the council directly. My world extracted minerals for Zephyrini corporations for 200 years, she said quietly. We were paid a fraction of market value and told we should be honored to contribute to galactic prosperity. When we asked for better terms, we were informed that the council would be disappointed if we proved ungrateful. Disappointed was the word they used, but we all understood what it meant. She looked at Kelser with something that might have been pitied. That humans came to our world and offered us fair market prices with no threats and no conditions, she continued. They treated us as equals from the first conversation. Why would we ever return to the old system when we've experienced what actual respect feels like? Lena pulled up another display showing coalition governance structures. We've built something different, she told the assembled council. The coalition operates on genuine democratic principles, with every member world having equal voice. Regardless of size or military power, we share technology freely because we believe that raising everyone's capabilities benefits all of us. We maintain collective security through mutual defense agreements where everyone contributes according to their ability and everyone receives protection according to their need. Most importantly, we don't demand tribute or subordination or acknowledgement of anyone's inherent superiority. The overseer's body flashed colors indicating deep thought. You want us to abandon the council structure entirely, it said slowly, to join this coalition as equals to species we once ruled? Elena shook her head. We're not asking you to join anything, she clarified. Each council species is free to make their own choices about their future. But if you want relationships with the coalition, those relationships will be between equals. No species gets special status or authority over others. No tribute and no subordination, and no recognition of inherent hierarchies. She pulled up the proposed framework that the coalition had prepared. This is what we're offering, she said while highlighting key points. Complete dissolution of council, monopolistic practices with all restrictive trade agreements, nullified reparations. 2 species who were economically exploited under council rule, and the reparations will be paid by the corporate entities that benefited, not by ordinary citizens. Restructuring of galactic governance as a true democratic federation where every species has equal representation. Former council species can join this federation on the same terms as everyone else, which means no special privileges, but also no special restrictions. Kelser stared at the proposal with his scales cycling through colors that indicated shock and dismay. This would mean the end of everything the council represents, he protested. The end of our authority and our status and our control over our own territories. Alina met his eyes calmly. Yes, she agreed, that's exactly what it means. The old system is ending, whether you accept it peacefully or fight against it until you have nothing left. But you're free to refuse these terms. She stood and gathered her materials with the same smooth efficiency she had shown 2 years ago. The coalition doesn't need council approval to continue existing and growing. She said we're doing just fine on our own, and will continue doing so, regardless of your decision. But we thought it was respectful to offer you the opportunity to participate in building something new rather than simply watching your old empire crumble. You have 6 months to decide, and after that, we'll assume you prefer to go your own way. Marcus followed her toward the exit, but she paused at the doorway and looked back at the council one final time 2 years ago. I sat in this chamber and listened to you tell humanity what we couldn't do and what we weren't permitted to have, she said quietly. You treated us like children. Who should be grateful for your guidance? You never understood that we didn't need your permission to be equals.